Welcome to episode 2 of Inside a Grandmaster's Thought Process. This is where you can compare your own thinking of a position with the thinking of a Grandmaster. That would be my thinking. And hopefully by the end of the video, you will understand the plans and ideas of this position and why you should play a certain way. And maybe even more importantly, why you shouldn't play the way that my student played. Because in this position, student from my simplified chess improvement system had a question because 10 moves after this position, which looks very unassuming, black resigned, was totally lost. So the key question really is, how does black prepare against white's pawn storm on the queenside? And what should black's move here be? What should black's plans and ideas be? And for this to be the most effective, I now invite you to stop the video and you can take up to 5 minutes. So we won't do, for all those that have seen the past video, we won't do blades, rapid, classical here. We'll do it a little bit differently. So take up to 5 minutes, come up with a plan, not just a move, but I want to hear a plan. You can put it in the comments down below. What is black's plan and how do we stop white's plan? What is white's plan? Well, how do we stop it? And think about it, stop the video, and soon you'll get a spoiler. So this position is really a bit different to many others that you might see online because it's not very concrete, right? You don't have like a forced line that you should calculate. There are so many candidate moves. You might have thought about playing f6. You might have thought about playing g6, rook f8, rook fd8, rook c7 to double the rooks. You might think about b5, knight to c5, knight to b6. Like, there are so many moves that are possible here. And before I want to go through these moves, or some of these moves at least, I want to try to explain you this position, how to think for both sides, because then the moves will make more sense. Okay, so this is a position that came from a Caro-Kann exchange, which is actually interesting because it's a position you might see more often in the French, right? So in the French, we have this e6, d5 structure. At some point, we play c5, and the structure just happens when the d pawn is traded against the c5 pawn. White has this strong central pawn on e5, just played f4, kind of hinting at a kingside attack. So in general, white here wants to play on the kingside, so bring the pieces to the kingside, where black wants to play on the queenside. So if you just know that, right, something like b5 comes to mind, the minority attack. Actually, also the student that posted this question said, is the minority attack the right thing? And when and how do I have to execute it? We'll get to that. Now to white's idea, it's really all about the move f5. Okay, this is super important in these positions. You could have it with a bishop on d3, for example, it's even stronger. But in this position where you see this f4 and e5 structure, white wants to push f5, ideally push f6, and attack the king. So maybe bring a queen to g4, take on g7, or there are other ways to do it. For example, one of the ideas is bringing the knight to d4, supporting f5, taking with the knight, and attacking again. So white's play is really kind of straightforward. White wants to make f5 happen, and the whole position and the evaluation of the position goes around, is white able to play f5 or are they not able to do it? That's basically all there is in this position. You can put different pieces on the board and it will mostly be about the same question. Can white push f5? Is it good for white if they push f5? If yes, white is better. If no, white is probably not having advantage. Maybe black is even quicker on the queen side, so then we're doing fine. So the first thing I do when I see this position is all about thinking about f5. So the very first thing I'm doing is f5 actually a threat? So let's just make an unassuming move, maybe rook to c7, okay? And we have to think about, is f5 actually a move that is happening right now? Let's look at this. f5, what is black doing? As a rule of thumb, this is super important. If white is playing f5 and you're not going to respond in any way, right? You're just making something, well, you probably messed up, okay? So if our response is something like rook c6, then white should be pretty happy. There are f6 ideas, there are queen g4 ideas. Always have to be careful with this e5 pawn, but maybe also just rook a e1, protecting this. And we need to do something against f5. So that's very important. So after f5, we want to take. Now it's important to see that e5 is hanging. So white takes with the rook on f5. Now black has this very good move g6. We kick the rook out and we take on e5. So we can consider that in the initial position, f5 is not a threat. That's super important because all of our moves have a little bit more time. Okay, we don't need to be super scared about f5 right now, but we need to keep it in mind that f5 is an idea. That means that in this position, we really have a wide variety of moves that we can make because f5 is not a threat. But for example, right, as an idea, if we move our knight away, that would be one idea. We could move it to b6 or to c5. Now f5 is already a little bit more valid because if we take, we play the same thing. Now e5 is not hanging anymore. Now we need a little bit more chess understanding. This pawn on e5 can sometimes be weak, right? We can play maybe even now rook e8, then put the knight back to d7, and then get after this e5 pawn. So this is starting to get a little bit more difficult where you need experience to know, is this e5 pawn weak or is white actually having an attack on the f-file? Right here in such a position where we have all the pieces actually standing pretty well close to the king, it's more of a weakness on e5 than we have a problem on f7. So we could move the knight away as well. So let's talk about ideas for black. So if we don't need to maybe stop e5 or stop this f5 idea, then what can we do? We have this idea of b5, b4. That is considered a minority attack. Minority just means you have less pawn on one side, right? So on these three files, you have 2 pawns only against 3. So you have the minority, but you're still attacking. So you push b5, b4, kind of try to get your queen in and attack on the queen side. That would be one idea. Another idea would be maybe to double the rooks, or to bring the knight somehow in the game, right? So to activate this knight. So if we play b5, this is super important. What could white do here? You can stop the video again and think about it if this is something that is unclear for you right now. So after b5, this is very, very common, especially if you see a long piece on this diagonal. We are weakening this pawn on a6. So what white is actually doing is saying, hey, now I attack on the queen side. Now I'm shifting my focus on the queen side because after a trade, for example, trading here, rook takes a4, we now have a super weak pawn on a6. So kind of white went from, oh, I'm trying to attack on the king side to, oh no, if you weaken yourself too quickly on the queen side, I'm actually attacking on the queen side. Play could continue something like knight to c5, attacking the rook and protecting that pawn. Rook is moving up to a3, and we have this very weak pawn. b4 might be coming, the rook might be shifting over here, and a6 is hanging. So if you had b5 as a move, probably you missed the idea of a4. So this is very important in this structure. Don't forget that white can still shift on the queen side, especially if this rook is still on a1, right? If we make a move like rook c7, for example, rook would move to e1, and now we play b5. Obviously, a4 is not as attractive anymore because there's just no rook that can recapture this pawn. So this is very, very important. Keep in mind, if you want to play b5 in these type of structures, again, mostly there will be even a white bishop on d3, right? And it kind of seems like it's only attacking h7, but no, it's also attacking this way. So b5, we always need to be ready to face a4. So that's another thing that can help you. So b5, not really what we want to do. Then we can think about, for example, this move knight to b6. Actually, spoiler alert, this is what happened in the game. And I just want to show you what happened, and then we can maybe, move backwards and see where did it go wrong? What happened here? Okay, so black played knight b6, white goes knight f3, knight to c4. So thinking about, oh yeah, I'm putting the nice knight on a nice square on c4, right? Knight is jumping into d4, queen to c7, rook is coming to c1. Both queen to c7 and rook c1 are not really the most precise moves because queen c7, I don't fully understand the idea, because the queen is anyway already kind of looking at this pawn once we take on f5. And the rook c1, the rook is never on the c file. The rook should always go on e1. So that would be more sensible. Okay, here, b5, now rook fe1. Ideally, you want to really have that other rook on the f file and the e file. You don't need to have anything on the c file. Knight is jumping back to b6, and now f5 is coming. And now we can see, we can realize, oh, if we know that f5 is the key move for white, now white's pieces are really standing well for f5. We did something that wasn't really useful, and so we have big problems. Queen to c4, black trying to trade queens. Nope, queen is moving away. Knight is coming into d7. f6 is happening. The king is really starting to get weak. Queen d3, rook e3, queen g6, and rook g3, and the game was over. Well, the last move of the game is queen f5, but the knight can take, but also g7 is hanging. So white just had a super strong attack. So something definitely went wrong for black. So if we move back, what do you think was going wrong? And actually, practically speaking, I think the first move is already a problem. Let's move back. So it might be tempting for you guys to say, oh yeah, this knight needs to be activated to c4, right? But let's talk about what is it actually doing on c4, okay? Sometimes you have these nice pieces that aren't doing anything, right? So the knight on c4 is, well, at the moment it would try to trade against this knight, but it kind of attacks b2, but the queen is anyway protecting it. Not really useful. It does put pressure on e5, but it also does it from d7, right? And now comes one of the most important things of this structure, right? White wants to push f5. How do we do that with white? White wants to bring the knight on d4 and then push f5. Knight on d4 is super strong piece. Now, what is the downside of a knight on d4 instead of a knight on d2? It is that white can bring the knight on e4. Okay? So, usually, if you play something like rook c7, white would go knight f3, black would go knight c5, knight to e4, knight to d4, knight to e4. Now we threaten this huge fork right here, and we stop all the protection of the e-pawn. So whenever f5 is happening, we can take and then just grab that pawn on e5 for free. So with that knight on c4, on e4, it's extremely difficult to actually make anything happen for white. So that means that we need to keep that knight on d7 in order to play knight c5, knight e4, whenever white is pushing this way. So if you're going to play knight to b6, you actually allow white to get the knight on d4. So that's super important. So knowing that, knight b6, also not really an idea. Now, you might argue, okay, in that case, let's play knight to c5, right? But knight c5 is kind of an empty move because, well, we just make it way too obvious that we want to play knight e4. Our opponent's probably not going to play knight f3. So, well, white just plays, for example, rook a1 and tries to push f5 with the knight on d2. So we're just giving away our idea too quickly. Maybe additionally, there will be some c4 ideas in the future, kind of bringing this knight on d6 after trade. So that could be also interesting for white. So knight c5, yeah, also not a bad move. Like if you're checking with the engine, nearly all of these moves are fine for black, okay? But it's not about that. It's really about having a plan, understanding this position. So if we are trying to bring things together, white wants to play f5. White wants to bring the knight on d4, but our way to stop the knight on d4 is knight c5, knight to e4. Our way to stop f5 is putting pressure on e5. And our idea at some point is b5, b4, but we really don't want to play b5 if white can go a4. So what actually remains are two moves that for me come to mind here with black. My first instinct, and I have to say that I've played a lot of French positions, so my instincts are very strong in this position, are to play rook f8 or to play g6. These are the two moves that come to mind, and I think from a human perspective, even though if you switch on the engine, again, we can do it later on, you switch on the engine, you will see, oh, everything looks equal, right? So it's hard to kind of understand why humanly speaking, there are big differences. If the engine is just going, oh yeah, everything is equal. What you need to understand is from an engine perspective, it will always have a concrete way of calculating things. And F5 will always concretely not work. But sometimes it's super unnatural for a human. Okay, so what we need to do as humans is to find a human way to stop F5, to stop the knight coming to D4, or at least be ready to play knight C5, knight E4. Then we have a logical game. So if we play something like rook F8, now what is white doing? If white goes knight F3, we know already what we're doing. We're playing knight C5, that's the wrong one, knight E4. Beautiful, we're happy with that. If white goes rook A1, what are you doing now? Well, A4 is not a move anymore, so we play B5, okay? So once you start understanding the plans in a position, everything gets very logical. And that's also the reason why I didn't do blitz, rapid, classical here, because I'm of the opinion if you understand this position well, you can play it extremely well, even in blitz chess, because you kind of have the intuitive, oh, rook is not on A1 anymore, there's no A4 anymore, I can go B5, right? Oh, I need to shortly look if F5 is working, F5 is not working, boom, let's go, because why again is F5 not working? Well, we have our usual response, take, G6, take on E5. That's all we gotta see, okay? Right? So there's a lot of knowledge that can help us having to calculate so much less if you actually understand the main plans. So I really, really like this rook F8 idea, kind of prophylactic, and there is not such an easy way for white to continue here because the most logical moves both give us a logical idea as well. White could play something like rook F3. The rook on F3 now is stopping the knight from getting to F3, maybe rook G3, okay, but we can also stop it with G6. So rook F3 is a little bit of a weird move. We can now go something like knight C5 or B5, maybe even G6, just say, hey, I'm waiting, you tell me what you're trying to do because this move doesn't really make sense. What are you trying to achieve over there, right? So maybe then the rook is coming, and again, now b5 even makes more sense. So we can have these kind of useful but not committal moves because both sides are kind of waiting, oh, where are you putting your knight? Where are you putting your rook? And then we can execute our plan better. So rook f3, I think in a practical game, you very rarely get this move. And then last but not least, there might be c4 as an idea to bring the knight on d6. Now it would be a nice fork. Here we can respond, for example, with the knight going to b6. There is a trade. Okay, knight e4 is happening. But now we play rook c6, we play rook d8, and this knight on d5 is equally strong to the knight on d6. And this pawn on f4 is a little bit weak as well, so this is totally fine. So knight coming here, we can even go here, maybe play f5. Actually, f6 is also an idea. This knight could get a little bit weak, and it's super important that we have this beautiful knight on d5, really attacking on f4, stopping any d-file, rook coming there, rook c1 is not working, we just trade and win a pawn. So black has good play right here as well. And c4, I would say, is more of a computerish idea. Humans will much more likely go for this f5 idea. So rook f8, very nice move. G6 has an interesting idea as well, right? G6 stopping f5. And for some, it is logical that once we play G6, white would play G4. Now, why is this a difference? Again, this is really weakening the white king more than the black king. So we could make an argument for playing G6, provoking the G4 move, and now playing rook f8. Okay, so this would be the second thing I would evaluate in a game. For example, now going rook a1, we again know we can play this b5 move. There's no a4 anymore. f5 is coming. We take with the pawn. With the e pawn is very, very important. Takes here, and we have, for example, queen takes e5 again, and this pawn is falling, so we are all good in this position with black. So this could be another way of playing, of first playing g6 to trying to provoke g4, arguing that this king is getting more weak than this king right here. there's not really a knight coming to f6, right? You don't have to worry about that too much. Either your knight is here, or in the case of c4, your knight would be on d5, protecting this f6 square, and e5 is still weak, and the king can get weak. We can play queen h4 at some point. So this is also very interesting. Now let's talk a little bit more about a move that I have seen in my community recommended. You might have written it down as well, which is the typical French move f6, and why I really don't like it right here. So f6 is always a huge decision. So if you're sitting at this position and you're thinking about rook c7, rook e8, b5, well, b5 there is a4, but still any knight move, these are all kind of things that, well, probably they are not absolutely terrible, right? But f6 can be very, very bad, because f6 is always inviting this new structure where we have a very bad, very weak pawn on e6, and this kind of constellation of two pawns can get extremely weak. Like, imagine we are not playing precise and we are just making some random moves. Let's say white is going rook a1, we go b5, okay? White is going, let's just ignore the fact that this pawn is hanging, we go h6, knight on d4. Such a position is absolutely terrifyingly bad. Like, you have this very weak pawn, there is a weak square on e5, you're never really going to push e5, this knight is very strong, there's no real counterplay. This is really bad, and I've played way too much French to know that all too well, that this is a very, very annoying position to play. So you really don't want to get into this. And even if we play something like rook cf8, there is this knight f3 move, takes on c4, takes on e6. And now we just have an endgame with an isolated pawn on d5. It's not really fun to play. It's not terrible, it's not lost by any means, but it's just not good. And so that's why when you play the move f6, you really, really, really need to make sure that either you're super desperate, everything else is horrible, right? Imagine f5 is just coming next move and it will completely destroy you. So you're saying, okay, I need to push against it, I need to push f6. That would be one thing. Or the other thing is you have very clear signs of counterplay against white's king, against this f4 pawn, that you're saying, okay, it's worth it having my weak pawn on e6. There are a few lines where f6 is the move, but it's always coming with such a downside that you gotta be careful. So if you can stop f5 like here with other means, I really don't recommend you're playing f6. So let's get to a conclusion about this position, but really this structure in general. If you're playing the back pieces, you always need to be ready to the push f5. And what you're doing against the push f5 is usually taking, and the downside of white is a weak pawn on e5. So you gotta calculate and think about, okay, what happens if white pushes f5? Very often we take, and we have this idea g6, and then e5 is hanging. Okay, so that's the first thing. To support this push, white will want to play knight f3, knight d4. The big downside is that the e4 square is then available for our knight. That means we want to keep the knight on d7. We don't want to push it to b6 and c4, where it looks nice, but it doesn't really do anything. And when we look at stopping white's idea, well, we can also look at our own idea, which would be b5, b4, pushing on the queenside. But we need to be careful, because after b5, there's always this strong or usually very interesting way for white to play a4. So usually we want to take a moment, wait for the rook to move away, and then play b5. Or at least we need to be ready that b5, a4 might be a thing, right? You might get the same position, but there is still a bishop on c8. Well, then in that case, b5 is not really bad, because we have the bishop on c8 to protect a6, right? So there are these general ideas, and then it depends which pieces are on the board and how good or bad is one or another idea. But this is kind of the summary from the black side, and that's why the two moves that I like most, or I will also look at even in a blitz game, intuitively, I will play rook f8 or I will play g6, because I'm just saying, okay, let's protect even more against the main idea. Let's keep our knight on d7, wait for any knight push to bring our knight to e4. Let's not weaken ourselves with f6, and let's wait to play b5, b4 until the rook is over there. So the right solution, I would say, in this position, from a practical sense, rook f8 or playing g6. If you have any other move, we can look at the engine. Let's do that. Right, so you can see right here, there are so many moves that seem totally fine from Black's perspective, but I just don't like the implication of h6. What is h6 doing, right? Practically speaking, what is h6 as an idea for Black? Doesn't really make sense, doesn't help us in stopping f5, and down the line we might get into problems. So don't really like h6. Rook c7, yes, okay, can be something, but are we really pushing everything on the queen side? f5 is dangerous, so not a huge fan of rook c7 either. Rook f d8, okay, but why on d8? It's not really doing much on d8. We don't have it on e8. We have the b5 move, but again, a4. Do we really want to play something like this? I don't like that endgame. You know, we just have one weak pawn right here. White is slightly pushing, I would say, even though, again, the engine is saying 0, 0, 0. So it's important that we are playing human chess and not engine chess. So in this position, even though in the top, what is it, top 5 moves, there is not rook f8 and there is not g6, I definitely consider those to be the most logical moves. And you can see the difference. Okay, 0, 0 against 0, 0, 1. Okay, nothing at all. And rook f8, the same thing. It's plus 0.1 if your opponent is going to play king h2 or this c4 move. Not really, you know, an important change of evaluation as well. And it's just important that we can play these moves quickly if we understand the position. So for example, again, rook a1, boom, we play b5. And you see, we're already slightly better, right? Maybe knight is coming here, boom, knight is c5. We can play these moves so quickly and suddenly, oh, Black is already much better. That was just because Black understood the position better. White didn't understand that, well, the knight should stay on d2 to stop this. Maybe we go king h2 and b4. That could be a practical example of how the game can actually evolve. And Black is so much better because we understand the position better. Boom, we attack this knight. Maybe the rook has to go over, and now we get rook c4. You see, there is also this g6 move to just stop f5, but maybe rook c4, rook doubling. Now we're much better, just because we understood the main plans. Oh, and actually one thing that I forgot to mention is this very absurd engine line that's saying knight b6 is not bad, because if white is playing knight f3, what you should do is playing knight d7 back. Obviously, right? And that's just because of this idea. We need to get to e4, or the second thing that the engine is recommended is knight a4, again with the idea knight c5, knight to e4. That's not really human. If we play knight b6, probably we wanted to play knight c4, so that's already the wrong plan right here. But again, if you understand the main plan, you can then also understand some of the weirder engine suggestions, because we really need to play against, against white's idea and bring a knight to e4. So knight a4, knight c5. Now you can see g6 again. We forcefully stop it. And then if g4 is happening, knight c5, knight e4 is happening. But again, which human is going to play knight b6 and then somehow bring the knight back to c5 and e4? Not very likely. Okay, that's it from this position. I hope you understood this Caro-Kann exchange, or, well, more predominantly the French structure better. If you have any questions, put them down below in the comments, and see you next time. Bye.